this video on?
Yes.
There we go. Thank you all. How are you guys feeling today?
Good.
I am having a fantastic day today, and so I'm going to read you about death. So this is from the 15th chapter of my most recent novel, Don't Read This Book. For context, the protagonist, Lena, was identified by 3 witches as the greatest writer in the world, captured and forced to write a novel so powerful that, if published, it would bring about the end of human civilization. The novel she writes is beyond my power, so I'm telling the story of her attempt to escape with the manuscript. This chapter is a flashback to the day she came up with the idea for the book itself. 3 years before the convention where Nigel Marion made his big presentation, Magdalena sat at the dinette table in her parents' kitchen and came up with the idea for the book that would possibly lead to the end of the world, though she couldn't have imagined it at the time. Her parents, her older brother Salvador, his wife Tanya, and their 3-year-old daughter Lucia were all out on the back porch of her folks' comfortable house in South Salem, Oregon, drinking beers and iced tea while Lucia entertained them with expansive stories about the social lives of her dolls. The little girl was already showing signs of her Aunt Lena's gift for narrative, a talent that was cute in a 3-year-old, but which hadn't done much for Lena's then 28-year-old aunt. Lena, meanwhile, stayed inside to keep her grandmother company. Lena held her 7-month-old nephew Daniel, keeping him out of the sun and most of the volume so he could sleep. Lena's brother Salvador was lighter-skinned, having more of her mother's Argentine pigmentation, but little Daniel, 3/4 black thanks to his mother Tanya, had a complexion far more like Lena's, who got her pigmentation from her father. She loved to look at Daniel's little fingers wrapped around one of hers while the baby slept. It felt to her like the baby's beauty could rub off on her, could justify the skin she'd been taught to distrust, even though she wore it. Sure, most of the distrust came from the broader culture, but it didn't help that she'd grown up with a racist grandmother, who was always open about the fact that she loved Lena in spite of her skin. Abuelita had escaped to the United States in the late 70s during the Dirty War, when her husband, Lena's grandfather, was disappeared because of his left-leaning sympathies. Abuelita came from money and detested the poor, and this feeling was exacerbated when, it seemed to her, her husband's concern for the poor had gotten him killed. To her horror, her daughter Maria, Lena's mother, had fallen in love with a black man in college. Lena's father, Delonte Wallace, had grown up firmly middle class, had multiple degrees in journalism, and had worked his way up to be the editor-in-chief of the Salem Statesman Journal. No small feat in a state that started out with whites-only language in the state constitution and still had a very low black population and a bubbling undercurrent of racism hidden beneath the smooth surface of Oregon nice. Still, to Abuelita, the color of Lena's father's skin meant he was underclass, and Maria's choice to muddy the purity of the family's mixed Spanish and German heritage with a Scottish last name given to an African slave brought a shameful end to the family's great history of success in Patagonia, where they'd been landed gentry for generations. Lena's eye was drawn away from the scene on the porch and the little hand wrapped around her finger by the glow and chatter of the television. There was an odd period in the late 20th century where, due to an accident of limited bandwidth for TV stations and an unusual quirk of American manners of the age, TV news prided itself more on telling the truth dispassionately than on being entertaining and partisan. It quickly recovered from this when it acquired excessive time and space on cable and found such manners were not profitable, proving American decency is always subservient to capitalism when given the chance. The news landscape fractured, the right-wing media finding it could make the most money by selling fear, the left-wing media selling intellectual superiority, and the centrist media selling the least relevant, most superficial kind of infotainment it could manage to call news with a straight face. Predictably, the left then called this centrist fluff intellectually inferior, and the right called it proof of a terrifying liberal conspiracy. Abuelita had chosen one of these centrist stations where the news toggled between 3 stories: a political sex scandal with no policy implications, a bear on the loose in a suburban neighborhood, and a high-speed chase on a freeway somewhere. Lena mixed them in her mind to entertain herself, imagining the bear revealed to be the mistress of the politician, who, caught in his passionate but shameful bestiality tryst, hopped into his car and tried to flee down the freeway at high speeds. Grinning, she wondered which of the characters would come to a more tragic end: the politician tased on the side of the road on live television, or the bear, caught in the suburb and interviewed about her affair for a grocery store tabloid. And what if the bear was now pregnant with the half-human, half-ursine child of the politician? Yes, that would be the story. This was just the prologue. The rise and tragic fall of President Half-Bear would be the bulk of the novel. ¿Cuándo vas a tener tu propia, mija? Her grandmother asked. Lena was insufficiently awakened from her reverie and couldn't compute. When will I have my own what? Half-human, half-bear hybrid? Then she realized her grandmother, without looking at her, was referring to the infant in her arms. Abuelita, you know I'm not going to have any kids. ¿Por qué no? Tus nietos quieren tanto, y eres muy bien con bebitos. Debes tener tus propios. Just because I love babies, I need to have my own? I love being an aunt, but I'm single, abuelita. Plus, I'm a lesbian, so that kind of complicates things. Her grandmother, still looking down at the onions and tomatoes she was chopping for the pozole, stuck the knife out to her side and wobbled it dismissively. A mí no importa eso. Eso no es nada. Puedes hacerlo con... She turned quickly and made a strange motion at Lena, holding up her hand and squeezing something invisible back and forth. Lena couldn't help but think it was a grotesque pantomime of squeezing a boob. She tried not to laugh, and her voice came out high-pitched and almost a screech. They can do it with what? What are you talking about? Maria! Abuelita shouted to her daughter on the porch. ¿Dónde está la cuenta de gotas para el polvo? What is she yelling about a turkey baster for? She's going to wake Daniel. Lena instinctively held her nephew closer to her chest and put her hand on his other ear, trying to keep her grandmother from waking him. He stirred and squeezed her index finger more firmly, but didn't wake. Then he started again when Lena's mother shouted back from the porch. En la segunda cajón a la izquierda del horno, mamá. Abuelita opened the drawer by the oven and pulled out the turkey baster. She pointed it at Lena somewhat accusatively, paused, then squeezed it twice to replicate her hand motion, as if to say, how could you not understand so obvious a gesture? Lena laughed. I know we can, abuelita, but it's a little more complicated. Y puedes hacerla sola. Well, sure, I could do it alone. That's not the point. I don't want to. Abuelita, I love that you think I would be a good parent, but a single parent? I don't think so. Her grandmother put her fist on her hip, not the one holding the turkey baster, but the other, which still held her large chopping knife, with the knife blade pointing out and swinging in a way that made Lena worry she'd accidentally poke herself or stab the other. ¿Por qué no? The question was accusatory. Lena knew her grandmother was primed for a fight if Lena said she didn't feel up to a task, any task. Scolding her children and grandchildren for their insecurities was how she showed them she loved them and believed in them. Well, for one thing, I make $12 an hour. I live in a tiny apartment. Abuelita interrupted, pointing the turkey baster at her for emphasis. Muchachas mucho más pobre que tú tienen hijos cada día. Of course, poor women than me have babies all the time. Again, not the point. Lena was tempted to say that women who were much poorer than she was were irresponsible if they were having tons of babies, but she knew she'd want to qualify it by limiting such a statement to the United States, then further to the middle-class suburban America, and pretty soon her argument dissolved before she could voice it. She decided on a different tactic. Why do you want me to have kids so badly, abuelita? Los niños son los que quedan después de que morimos. Kids stick around after we die. What brought this on? But abuelita, there are lots of things people leave behind when they die. Sculptures and buildings and pieces of music, and the good we do for other people. A smile for the right person on the right day has ripples. She noticed her grandmother's raised eyebrow. Ripples, círculos en agua, los que crecen cuando algo cae en el agua. Oh, ondulaciones. Es la misma palabra que pezones en inglés. She pointed at one of her own breasts with the turkey baster. Lena laughed. No, ripples, not nipples, abuelita. Ondulaciones son ripples. She rolled her eyes. The good we do in the world has ripples, not nipples. A mí no importa si tus sonrisas tienen ondulaciones o pezones. Debes tener hijos. She doesn't care if my smiles have ripples or nipples as long as I have kids. Got it. Makes perfect sense. Lena frowned. I reject this idea that a woman is only valuable if she's a mother. Abuelita shook her head. No soy machista, no tiene que ver con hombres y mujeres. Seres humanos necesitan pasar los genes. Este es el punto de la vida, la familia. You might not think you're a chauvinist, but the idea that people are only valuable if they pass on their genes sounds like some shit straight out of the patriarchy to me. Lena shook her head slowly. I just can't accept that if I don't pass on my genes, I'm some giant Darwinian failure. There's got to be more to life than just passing on my DNA. At this, her grandmother turned back to her work, putting the turkey baster back in the drawer, closing it just a little too hard, and cutting the vegetables just a little too quickly. Los jóvenes siempre piensan que son inmortales, she said over her shoulder. I'm not so young that I think I'm immortal. Damn, I'm 28, not 17. I don't think I'm immortal, abuelita. I just don't want to find immortality through children. Pues, ¿cómo quieres encontrarlo? How do I expect to find immortality? That's a good question, actually. Well, I want to write books. ¿Y estás escribiéndolas? Am I writing them? Well, a few might turn into books someday. I'm working on some short stories. Cuentos cortos y novelas no son lo mismo. ¿Quién lee cuentos cortos ahora? I know novels and short stories aren't the same, Lena thought. And some people do read short stories. She said, Alice Munro wrote short stories and she won a Nobel Prize for Literature. Uno, ella es la única. Y fue blanca y de Canadá, donde aprovecha mejor sus escritores. Lena couldn't argue with that. Alice Munro was, in fact, white, and Canada did take much better care of their writers. Abuelita was on a roll now. Nadie va a dar un premio Nobel a una muchacha negra de los Estados Unidos que escribe cuentos cortos que nadie lee. Lena felt like she'd been punched. She could only repeat it in her mind. Nobody's going to give a Nobel Prize to a black woman from the United States who writes short stories that nobody reads. Short stories that nobody reads, she whispered. It would take many years for Lena to fully understand that her grandmother wasn't trying to cut her with that comment. Her grandmother was trying to grapple with the feeling that her own life had been pointless, and had reached out and taken hold of the nearest example at hand, her granddaughter's failure as a convenient metaphor. This justification would grow in Lena's mind over time, until it was bigger than the pain of the comment, because that's how forgiveness often works. I'll stop there.